Konnichiwa. Hello from London, and I thought today I'd give you a bit of an update on my basic Japanese project. I started learning Japanese a full 22 months ago now, in advance of my first trip to Japan in the autumn of last year. So I put in 9 months before I went to the country. I was enthused by the trip, and I decided to continue learning the language when I got back. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Dr. Gareth Popkins. Here we talk about language learning from many angles. It's not only my own project, but also useful tips, looking at methods, interviews with inspiring language learners, and a bit of language-related vlogging as well. So if you haven't yet subscribed for the vibe, please do. And you can get my free Language Learner Pro training by following the link underneath this video. Now, during the last year or so, I've been aiming to put in 30 minutes a day of focused study on my Japanese 5 days a week. I last reported back to you on where I'd got to by the end of July. Since then I've continued. In August I put in 18 hours and 10 minutes and I missed 8 days that month, but otherwise I maintained a regular study pattern, and 3.5 hours of that total was one-to-one conversation practice via Zoom or Skype. In September I put in 21 hours 25 minutes. I missed 7 days, and that included 4 hours of conversation in the total. And then in October, it wasn't such a good month. I clocked up 13 hours and I actually missed 11 days. There was only half an hour's conversation practice. It was quite a heavy month in the office last month, but still I kept going nevertheless for 2/3 of that month. So the total where I'd got to at the end of October was 352 hours and 5 minutes since I started working on the language in January 2019. Now, my strategy with Japanese has really been to try and get a mental scaffold of the grammatical language patterns, the structures in my head, and to get a core vocabulary, rather than trying to speak a lot at the beginning, and rather also than trying to get a lot of listening practice from the very start. With my more recent language projects, for example with Basque, I've tended to put emphasis on speaking early and speaking often. So it's interesting to compare the approaches again, comparing Basque and Japanese. I did though get speaking in July when I started having one-to-one lessons, actually as part of a group program called a Conversation Accelerator that was run by my friend John Fotheringham over at Language Mastery. And as part of that I had to record a short self-introduction video, clips of which I shared in the last update here on the channel in July. In my self-introduction video I was still using pretty basic, very basic actually, introductory beginner's sentences in Japanese, despite the fact that at that stage I'd put in 286 hours or so on the language by the end of the first week of July. Is this somewhat disappointing performance? Well, it did feel like a struggle to start to activate what I'd already learned, and I think that though is quite normal. And I think it's reasonable to expect progress then to be more rapid when you've done such a lot of preparation, when you actually finally start speaking. I started to think again, would it have been better if I'd actually been doing more speaking from the beginning, getting more output practice as I went? Could that have actually helped me, because it's an interactive way of learning, to remember the words and the patterns better? Quite possibly, but it seems to me that, as happened with Basque, I'd have been paying and spending time going over the same things again and again live with teachers, having very, very basic conversations. It's a difficult balance to strike, but I have felt happy so far with my more studious, I suppose, and self-conscious attempts to learn the basic patterns and the vocab of the language at this stage. If I'd been learning a Western European language, after 286 hours, French or German, Italian, I might expect to be already into the lower intermediate stage, what we call B1 on the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. Japanese, though, is a bit different. And first of all, we've got to remember we've got to deduct from that 286 hours quite a bit of time I'd spent working on the scripts of Japanese up to last July. So that might take me down to about 240 hours again. On the other hand, we could add back in a lot of additional listening practice I got through using the Pimsleur course as I was jogging around the park, which I've never included in my language totals. I'd still, though, by July, not have been at much more than perhaps 300 hours of work on the language. So you might say one would expect, if you put a big push into activating the language, that I should be getting now, with more speaking practice, to a lower intermediate level already. There were certainly some aspects of Japanese which are easier than languages like German or French. A relatively simple verb system, no genders to worry about, grammatical gender of the words, and so on. On the other hand, Japanese is very alien. It works in a very different way from Western European languages. So I think it pays to be realistic about how rapidly I'm going to move through the stages when I actually do start speaking. It's always a long haul, however you cut it, however you order it, when you're learning a new language. What else was going on in August, September and October, as well as continuing with some one-to-one speaking sessions online? Well, the core of my project so far has been my central textbook course, Japanese from Zero, and I'm on book 3. And during September I finished Unit 12 of the 13 units or lessons in that book. 12 introduced a couple of important new verbs, dekiru, can, or to be able, and kawaru, to turn into, to change into. I'd actually come across both of these before in one of the other courses I'm using, and it's this coming at things again from different angles, I think, which is quite useful to add a bit of variety and a bit of reinforcement, a bit of recognition when you come to things in one textbook that you've already done in another. Another thing that was introduced in Unit 11 was taking adjectives that end in E and putting a ku on the end to change them into adverbs. And also an interesting culture clip about the way the Japanese still use the eras, the reigns of the emperor, as a way of giving dates. So in the 20th year of the Meiji era, for example, you might say. How that's going to work in practice, I don't know, but they do still use that system as well as the Western system as well. I don't know if I'll ever be able to convert in my head. In Unit 13, the final unit of Japanese from Zero, the potential form of the verb, the eru form, was taught for the first time. That was something brand new for me, very interesting. If you want to say something, I could do something, it would be possible, that's the form that you can use. And like most of the Japanese, all of the Japanese verb structures I've seen so far, actually, it's quite simple and quite regular, at least in theory, though doing it well in practice, of course, is going to be a different matter. Now, there are 5 books in the Japanese from Zero series, but I've taken the decision, at least for the rest of this year, not to move on to book 4. And I'll come back at the end to talk a bit about how I'm going to go forward in November and December. But I also just briefly wanted to mention the other secondary courses that I'm using, Assimilez le Japonais, which I've continued to work through. At the end of July, I'd got to lesson 37 of the 98 that are in there. And by the end of October, I'd moved forward a bit to lesson 44. And the main thing I'm doing with those books is actually dictation exercises. They've got great audio, great conversational texts, and I've continued to work through those. The Pimsleur audio course that I had been using, particularly in the first half of this project, has been on hold, mainly because I've been using the time that I used to use to listen to the course when I'm jogging or walking around the park, to listen to Basque native level radio to keep that going. So it's always a trade-off between one language and another when you're learning two at the same time. I've talked before about an older book that I acquired, a very old edition of Teach Yourself, which is very grammar heavy, sort of quite an old-fashioned grammar and translation method, which I've been using as a secondary source of reference, and because it has quite a lot of exercises in it. I wasn't able to get the audio that originally came with that book in the form of gramophone records, but what I have done is had one of my teachers record sentences for me, which I'm using again for dictation and for listening practice. In the last video I put up on the channel about my Japanese was an unboxing, if you like, with Colloquial Japanese, another old version of a series which is still going but of completely different books. The Colloquials from Routledge arrived through the post. That was a couple of months ago. Now that one I really like because it's very, very conversationally based again, but it has very short exchanges, A, B, just a man and a woman, couple of sentences from both in a short exchange. That means it's very, very easy to handle these little conversations. And there's quite a lot of explicit explanation too of the structures of the language and some exercises at the back. It's not as comprehensive as the older Teach Yourself course, but the language just seemed to me to be more natural and more modern. So I'm not sure it would be a good thing to use on its own, but certainly as part of my arsenal. I'm probably a bit too diffuse in all the different courses I've got, but it's adding some variety. So how's it looking for me in the last 2 months of the year? What are my plans for the project? Well, I think really consolidation is the name of the game. I'd like to enter a new phase next year, and I want to use the remaining time that I've got this year in November and December to spend some time going over the first 3 volumes of Japanese from zero, but also to continue with the other 3 books that I've shown you that I'm using, to continue to build up my confidence in how the language works, my familiarity with the basic patterns, and making sure that I'm interactively practicing, even still in a very artificial way, with dictations, with the written exercises and so on, the core vocabulary. And then I think I'll be ready to move into a new phase with the language in the new year. But it's steady as she goes, continuing with the approach that I've been taking since the beginning really with this language. And I look forward to bringing you up to date on how I've gone pretty soon again here on the channel. Are you learning Japanese? How's your approach differ from mine, if it does? Do share your experiences in the comments below, and thanks a lot for watching. And as always, if you haven't yet subscribed for the vibe, please do. Think about a thumbs up, tickle that bell, and share the affair. じゃあまたね。